Why has Britain been among Ukraine's biggest backers in the Ukraine war? Infamously, Boris Johnson sabotaged the negotiations in early 2022 that could have brought an early peace in Ukraine. Keir Starmer is the co-lead of the Coalition of the Willing, and Britain's media and public intellectuals, even their historians, are among the most ardent of supporters of Ukraine. Why? And here is the kicker. They went all in for the war. Now they might lose it all as Ukraine approaches its collapse. Britain sought greatness in Europe by fighting Russia in Ukraine. Ukraine's looming defeat is threatening anarchy in the UK. Welcome everyone, I'm Jeff Rich. This is The Burning Archive, where I explore big world events with some quality world history. Today is 18th of November. Volodymyr Zelensky has just met with Emmanuel Macron in Paris. There's debate about the leadership of Keir Starmer in Britain. And, who knows what Donald Trump is about to do in Venezuela. So I do mention that because this video is part of my series looking at the Ukraine Endgame, exploring the role of each of the 5 main states that are party to this war: Russia, Ukraine, the United States, the European Union, and the focus of this program, Britain. You can check back on some of my videos. They're linked in the video description below if you want to get my overview analysis. But the big picture is that the Ukraine war is deadlocked, partly because each of those 5 states doesn't really know how to move from overt conflict to a genuine process of conflict settlement and enduring peace building. I've explored what that looks like from Russia and the United States perspective, and today I'm looking at Britain. Now, Britain, I argue, is one of the blockers of peace in Ukraine, just as it is one of the most ardent advocates of war in Ukraine. Peace and security in Europe requires less Britain. In 2016, Britain chose Brexit to leave the European Union, but they remained in Europe via NATO, Gibraltar, Cyprus, Eastern Europe, and its extensive military and intelligence and economic engagement, political engagement with Ukraine. But now is the time, I believe, if we're to see peace in Ukraine, if we're to see peace in Europe, in peace in the world, for Europe to kick Britain out if there is any genuine chance of peace and security in Eurasia. So, first question is really, why do I make the claim that Britain is a separate party to the war in Ukraine, different to the United States, different to the European Union? They are often lumped together. Britain is part of NATO. Britain does meet with European powers as part of the Coalition of the Willing, and is often, since it used to be part of the European Union, is lumped together with the Europeans. And of course, in Britain, they do tend to think that they have a very special relationship with the United States. It is important to note that, since 2016, formally a little bit later, it took a little bit of a while to actually implement the Brexit referendum. Britain is not part of the European Union, and in a paradoxical way, this has forced its diplomacy, in the world and in Europe that become a much more heavily reliant upon its military engagement in Europe, that is through NATO. The lingering presence of Britain in Europe is now much more a military and intelligence presence than it was before 2016. And even the relatively pro-Ukraine, pro-Western war against Russia in Ukraine, Adam Tooze, the economic historian, has said pretty clearly in his assessment of Britain's role that, in a way, Britain has gone, particularly under Keir Starmer, all in on its role through NATO. In a way, the belligerence of Britain in NATO in the Ukraine war is a reflection of its diplomatic weakness in the European Union, structurally and institutionally having, self-harmed itself by leaving the European Union. And of course, there is an element of imperial nostalgia, the belief that, the Anglophone, the English-speaking peoples, as in Winston Churchill's idea, could get together again under the moral leadership of the uniquely talented British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I believe they still call themselves that, the old headquarters of the British Empire. But the other thing about this is, because Britain is acting as a separate state, people can talk about vassals, but it has, significant resources of power. It is a member of the UN Security Council. After all, it is a nuclear power. It has, overseas territory, sovereign territory in Gibraltar, i.e. Spain, and in Cyprus, i.e. arguably Greece, still after all these years, as well as presence in Eastern Europe, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So it is a substantial power, and that sort of talk about vassals and all that sort of thing really just obscures what's really going on. But the thing about it being an independent state is it also has its independent war aims. It is pursuing specific objectives, military objectives, in this fight in Ukraine. Different from Ukraine, however much people in Britain might believe they are rallying behind Ukraine. They are pursuing interests in Ukraine, and different from Europe and in the United States. So first, I think it's important to get clear on the large role of Britain in this war, that it's not just some dad's army that's doing what Donald Trump tells it to do. There's three big roles of Britain in this war. First is its, diplomatic role, its role in choreographing, chairing indeed, the coalition of the willing. Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron have co-chair that group, the coalition of the willing, the European and British powers and Canada, I think also, who are strongly invested in the war. And this builds on a long pattern going all the way back to 2014 of being heavily invested in a diplomatic way in this war. There is a very heavy investment of the British elite in the anti-Russia alliance, particularly in Eastern Europe, and part of what's been going on over the last 20 or 30 years in both the EU and the NATO, the European side of NATO, has been the Easternisation of Europe, the growing role of Poland and the other East European states. The Baltic states, as represented by Kaja Kallas from Estonia, now the Foreign Minister of Europe, and a particularly ardent anti-Russian group. And in many ways, the British have been the cheerleaders of that coalition, but also for the anti-Russia group within Europe, if you like. It's been very strongly supportive of those within Europe who've sought to break with Russia rather than build bonds with Russia. A contrast, for example, to Angela Merkel, let alone Gerhard Schröder, Jacques Chirac, etc. in an earlier period. The other thing is, with their diplomatic self-sabotage in 2016, leaving the EU, their diminishing role in world trade and cultural power, Britain is heavily now invested in its sort of military intelligence role via the NATO alliance for its power and influence in the world. And when you're relying on that kind of thing, unfortunately, you tend to be a bit of a warmonger. The second big role is, of course, their intelligence sharing, and this is perhaps the strongest contribution of Britain. Of course, people talk about MI6. It's part of the British sort of self-image that they're all, they talk about C and all the sort of James Bond and Jean le Carré sort of references that seem to be endemic within British political culture. But it is also widely reported that they have a particularly strong role in influencing, supporting, or providing bodyguards and advice to the Zelensky government in Kiev. And so this is a very big role for Britain, and part of their role as co-chairs of the coalition of the willing. It is, if you like, the diplomatic strongest backers of Ukraine as the United States tries, as it has done over the last 6 to 9 months, tried to back out of the war unilaterally. And then the third big role, of course, for Britain is a direct military role, and they're quite candid about this. There's a House of Commons report that provides a very detailed history of the Britain's role, and they're quite proud of the fact that they are one of the leading partners in providing vital support to Ukraine. Indeed, from the British government's website, you can read that the UK has committed up to £21.8 billion for Ukraine, with $13 billion in military support, up to $5.3 billion in non-military support, and additional coverage for export finance. So it's a very significant role. They've been reportedly involved in all sorts of operations, including, of course, the notorious Operation Spiderweb, when Ukraine attacked the nuclear triad of Russia and arguably risk nuclear war in the world. Now, I could go into a lot more detail about this, but I think I've covered the main points about their early and sustained leadership, their major military aid provision, including artillery, tanks, missiles, drones, air defence systems, ammunition. Of course, there's arguments about how much and how significant, but nonetheless, they have been a major contributor. And, of course, their diplomatic advocacy and intelligence sharing role. But it's the intelligence role in Europe that I want to focus on in particular, because I also think it highlights to some degree what some of the war aims of Britain may be in this war, and also why it may be necessary to extricate Britain, or to put Britain in the back seats of the negotiation table, at least for a while, if we're going to have a genuine peace settlement in this war. Britain, of course, is a member of the Five Eyes alliance: America or USA, Britain, Canada, Australia with its notorious Pine Gap base, and New Zealand as well. And this is part of a global intelligence collection, analysis, and I guess deployment system. The Pine Gap base, for example, is reputed to be involved in various strikes from US and US allied forces across Eurasia. Britain is also a key NATO contributor in many ways. NATO was back in 1949 conceived as partly a way for Britain to extend its political and military influence within a then economically shattered Europe, while the British Empire was still strong. It's played a key role in human and signals intelligence, and this is part of its influence. And in particular, one should note that two of the big overseas bases, overseas territories, let's call them military colonies, shall we, Gibraltar and Cyprus, their significance, and the British armed forces are quite open and brag about this on Sky News, are listening bubbles into Europe, into the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean as well. Gibraltar is a very small territory. Britain conquered it in an illegal and immoral invasion in about 1707, and Spain still disputes the territory, Britain's hold over the territory, and there's a similar situation in Cyprus, reflecting Britain's imperial past, which, at least in its intelligence network around the world, hasn't quite died yet. Similarly, Britain plays a major role in cyber operations and, of course, the whole sort of information war that is so prevalent. And similarly, Britain is heavily involved in the military bases under NATO frameworks in Germany, the Ramstein Air Base, in Cyprus, the critically important Akrotiri RAF base in Cyprus, which is used for surveillance flights and gathers intelligence over the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, spying on Russian operations, and also presumably being used in the deployment of attacks on Russia as well. It's a major staging and logistics base for aid flights into Ukraine and special operations support, or those special operations soldiers, which of course are not actually boots on the ground in Ukraine, and it's also been a key base, of course, in some of the Israeli operations in Palestine. Similarly, there's a major British role in Estonia, and of course I've mentioned Gibraltar's sort of espionage and naval presence as well. So Britain is actually part of this sort of imperial network of bases. It's not the top dog, but it does play an independent role. The question, I guess, is why? Why is Britain so ardent? Why is Britain so bellicose all the way back and ever since at least 2014 and even beforehand? Some would argue Britain has really been at war with Russia and the Soviet Union and the various successor states since at least 1917. There is a very deep strand of Russophobia that runs through Britain. I've written about this. I did a YouTube video about Russophobia, but I'm also at the moment doing my series on my World History World Tour on Substack, looking at Russian history in some depth, and that includes my guide to Russian history, which viewers who want to get over Russophobia may want to check out as well. So I think here it's useful to, again, return to my framework about making sense of this war. There's three elements. There's one, recognising it's a 5-state war that's moving from active conflict to war termination phase, but not yet conflict settlement phase. And everyone's trying to work out exactly how they can do that. But the second big element is to work through a 3-step process of responding to the root causes of the war, of building a coalition or a peace party, a coalition for peace within each of the 5 states. And then each of those 5 states actually being able to act with sovereign authority, sufficient sovereign authority towards peace, genuine and enduring peace agreements. There's no point having a government say, yes, we'll do this, and then just have a different opinion the next day. There's no point making agreements with what has long been known as perfidious Albion, that will say one thing and then does not follow through. And these are the 3 steps one needs to go through. I'd respond, not just identify, but actually respond to the root causes, build the peace party, and act with coherent follow through as a sovereign authority in each of these 5 states. And if those states are not really ready to do that, then perhaps they're not quite the right person, right party to be leading the peace negotiations. And that is, I guess, one of the issues with Britain. So and then the final element of all this is looking at the root causes. And to look at the root causes and to acknowledge that all of the parties to the state have causes for the war, have motivations for conducting the war, pursuing their objectives that need to be explored. I use a basic framework articulated by the historian Richard Overy in his book about causes of war. We talk about 4 broad motives in addition to more sort of, I guess, fundamental psychological, biological factors about aggression and stuff. But 4 basic motives about war: resources, belief, power and security. And when one looks at Britain's root causes, I think we can see each of these factors in play. But it's less clear to me that Britain, at least, is actually in a position to really acknowledge and respond to how its motivations are driving this war. So the first factor one can look at is power. Britain reasserting it, or reasserting its power in the world, or at least just asserting the power where it has the capacity to assert the power. And here it's very much, as I said, dependent upon its anchor in the NATO alliance and its role in working with the sort of American-disposed, more aggressive East European states as part of the easternization of Europe. That is where, I guess, the power base of Europe, the power base of Britain within Europe lies in military intelligence and in Eastern Europe. And as a result, Britain has become something of a leech on the alliance and has actually actively pursued Eastern Europe as a domain for power influence. Indeed, the British Council on Geostrategy wrote in 2021 that Britain was Eastern Europe's new guarantor for the foreseeable future. It wrote, the United Kingdom looks set to be the most purposeful European diplomatic and security actor in Eastern Europe. Over the past 5 years, Britain has tilted towards the region. 5 years from 2021 is broadly saying since 2014, and Britain was very early into the Ukraine conflict after 2014, deploying military support. Over the past 5 years, Britain has tilted towards the region with a range of military deployments and practical demonstrations of its commitment to address threats and challenges. Central to the UK's Eastern European tilt is Russia, to which London has a distinctive policy to those of Europe's 2 other large European states, France and Germany, with major elections in prospect in both and the likely changes of leadership to not profoundly alter their current stances on Russia, perhaps a misjudgment, the UK's contribution to Eastern Europe's security looks set to remain the most purposeful of Europe's large states, and with the European Union struggling to forge a collective voice on Russia, the UK's guarantor role in Eastern Europe may grow further still. And they said this corresponds with the Russia element of the new administration of Joe Biden in the United States. Unlike France and Germany, the US approach appears to be focused on re-establishing stability in the US-Russia relationship rather than a transformational warming, i.e. starting a war. This emerging UK and US correspondence of approaches contrasts with the French-German position, which seeks normalisation with the current regime in Russia. So let me just interpret that a little bit for you. Effectively, what they are saying is Britain actively pursued a policy of divorcing Europe from Russia, divorcing the sort of attempts to form collective security between France, Germany, and played along with the aggressive Russophobic trends in both the United States and Eastern Europe to bring on the war in Russia. So that's a very driving factor. And just as Brian Beletic will point to various US think tanks that set out strategies like weakening Russia, I guess that think tank is there articulating, I don't think it's devising the strategy, I think it's just articulating the sort of mind hive beliefs of the British foreign policy elites in saying, we've lost our formal role in Europe, we have to fight for Eastern Europe in order to make sure Europe does not make peace with Russia, because then Britain really is stuffed. They might even kick us out of Cyprus and Gibraltar. So that's one thing. The second thing is belief, and in the way in which it's articulated by the British, there is a real belief in a values-based diplomacy, a strong belief in the liberal rules-based order. But underneath that, I think there is a very deep tradition of Russia hatred in Britain, in both the foreign policy and business, diplomatic, security agency elite, but also in the sort of public intellectual world, even in the history establishment. You can see this in the reactions of people like Dominic Sandbrook, for example, at the start of the war. Russia hatred, a crusading belief in British liberalism and other sorts of beliefs have actually been one of the key drivers of one of the root causes of this war that have driven this desire for Britain to break the potential partnership between Europe and Russia and to pursue a war. Thirdly, there's also clearly resources. As we know, Britain under Keir Starmer formed a 100-year agreement, which included issues like rare earths and energy and agriculture and other sorts of interests. Britain does have some very large mining companies and other kind of interests like that, as well as, of course, as the various financial and insurance interests. And there is also, I guess, just the interest that forms about having this old empire, this remnant empire of intelligence and spies and perceived soft power influence. There is a genuine belief in Britain that they, punch above their weight in terms of diplomatic influence in the world. And there has also been long for a long, long time, a interest in the breakup of Russia in order to loot its resources. You can actually read cabinet minutes from 1917 where the British government, with Winston Churchill in it, the British cabinet is actually talking about, as it's going into the Civil War, intervening in the Civil War to overthrow the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the British government is looking to break it up and get access to the resources. This is the fundamental idea behind all of Mackinder's weird ideas about Eurasian World Island and all the rest of it. They basically reflect, again, the hive mind of British geopolitics and its desire to basically get control of Russian land, territory, resources and people. I guess a German chancellor in the 1930s had a very similar idea. And finally, the fourth area is security. Often this is perceived in a defensive way. Russia's security was threatened by the eastward expansion of NATO. But similarly, Britain very much sees its security, its ability to project its role as a Five Eyes power around the world in terms of its control over the various seas and dominions of the world. Its interest in the Black Sea is one of the key issues that it was actually pursuing. There was actually a proposal, I do believe, to establish a sort of British-oriented port in the Black Sea as part of the sort of Ukraine situation. Britain is heavily invested in the whole networked empire of bases, the pointillistic empire of bases, as the brilliant Nell Penilla describes it. It's heavily invested in intelligence and special operations that also affect the perception of security in other states. I heard a report some years ago that most of the intelligence that the United States gets on Russia comes via the British intelligence services. And of course, the British intelligence and related services played a large role in the whole Russiagate scandal, of course. So those four causes, those four root causes of power, belief, security, and resources are the thing. But the question you have to ask is Britain actually capable of responding to those four causes? I think the answer is no. The Russian threat is just crucial at the moment to support, to mobilise support internally for Britain, and also not just sort of like domestic political politics. There's all sorts of it's a fragmenting, resentful, bitter society at the moment, Britain, with limited and weak legitimacy of all the governing and contending parties. But it's also important to mobilise support behind Britain having a big role in the world. And you can see some of the concerns amongst the British foreign policy elite networks with the declining desire for Britain to be engaged in this sort of big role in the world. That's what they're freaking out. They're saying the people don't understand how important it is that Britain still has a spy base in Gibraltar and Cyprus and in Eastern Europe and the Falkland Islands, and that it still gets to play James Bond games and John le Carré games here in 2025. And in many ways, Ukraine, as the biggest state in Eastern Europe, the second biggest state in Europe other than Russia, the second biggest army of the biggest army in Europe before the war, the controller of the Black, the one of the dominant powers of the Black Sea. Ukraine is actually both the linchpin and the launch pad of this this sort of desire to keep the Russian threat going. And it has been, that is why I guess Ukraine has been so crucial both to British foreign policy strategy, and I think one has to see that's the case rather than just see it as being pointless. It actually makes sense if you accept they're the objectives that you're pursuing. They're evil objectives, or they're wicked objectives, but they're the objectives they're pursuing. Ukraine is actually the linchpin and the launch pad for that. So when Ukraine falls, this whole British foreign policy strategy will fall. So in a way, both Britain and the Ukraine are like sort of two drowning people who are clinging to each other desperately to keep things going. And coincidentally, of course, just over the last week or two, there have been troubles and leadership rumbles for both Starmer and Zelensky at the same time. I doubt those things will change before this video comes out. I think we're probably going to be with Starmer and Zelensky for some time yet, but you never know in politics, really, do you? But turnover at the top does not really change the institutional settings. It doesn't really change those deep motivations that I talked about that are the root causes of Britain's bellicosity in this war. So if we're looking at step one of moving from war to peace in Ukraine, you can see why it's deadlocked from Britain's point of view. There's really no viable way that Britain can pursue its current set of objectives, its current bellicose war aims through peace, because if it loses control of its operations in Ukraine, its whole strategy of being the militant garrison of Eastern Europe aggression towards Russia will fall apart. So the second step is really about the peace party, and I'll be a bit briefer about this because I think basically I just don't see there's any functional peace party in Britain at the moment. All those drivers are very heavily embedded, very heavily institutionalised in Britain. I think they're just going to have to realise that we're going to see, further problems, further catastrophes happen. And in particular, I think when the whole Ukraine political situation, social situation collapses, I think that will expose both the intellectual, moral and strategic bankruptcy of the British elite. But at the moment, there really is no prospect of a peace party emerging in Britain. And I think this is an important point to think about in terms of a process for broader establishment of a process for genuine peace settlement. If we go back to that Council on Geostrategy paper, where Britain is actively seeking to push all the European sensible, sincere, well-based interests in Europe away from forming natural, neighbourly, friendly, cultural, diplomatic, security, other economic partnerships with Russia in order for Britain to assert its role as the guarantor of security in Eastern Europe and believe, again, it's a great empire, then, there's no real likelihood of a peace party emerging in Britain. And I don't really, for all the talk about leadership coups and the Reform Party, etc., I really don't see any prospect of one emerging in the political system there in Britain at the moment either, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day. Finally, we look at sovereign authority. Now, this is less of a problem. Britain has more capacity to act as a clear, capable, sovereign state than, if you like, the United States. One of the advantages, I guess, of the Westminster system is that, you form a parliamentary majority, the government is a coherent executive, and basically things get done. You don't have the bizarro vetocracy of the United States. Again, there is also a lot of talk about Starmer being about to fall, and somehow his low popularity might force a change, that people will revolt, and that will ultimately lead to a sort of a change in perspective or collapse somehow. People like Douglas McGregor and others talk about it in that sort of way. I think it is important to note that the British executive is actually pretty well consolidated, and it's also has this cohesive establishment elite that are deeply invested in this war. Now, although there is a political party crisis at the moment, I think, especially coming from Australia, we know that, debates about leadership do not necessarily lead to fundamental changes in how political parties, let alone governments, operate. So if I summarise our 3 steps, there's very strong motivations for Britain to be a bellicose party in this war that makes sense within its current elites and, broad social elites' outlook on the world, and is unlikely to change soon. So there's really no prospect of them identifying and then responding to those root causes of their participation in the war. There's no real prospect of them being a peace party emerging in Britain, and although there might be complaints and dissent, that elite group that is pursuing a bellicose party is functionally well established, able to do what it wants to do, and doesn't look like it's about to fall anytime soon. So I think this has implications for how the other parties to the conflict respond and manage the process for moving from overt conflict to conflict settlement. I believe Britain's role should be subordinated. It should be not the leader of the coalition of the willing. If you like, let's imagine a situation where Russia proposes that the primary party for the negotiations should be the European Union in some sort of reimagined form, and I'll get to the European Union in a video next week. And both the US and Britain start to play a lesser role in matters, and Britain's role in sabotaging, if you like, internal views within Europe that want to pursue security partnerships with, and economic and cultural and social partnerships, political partnerships with Russia, its neighbour, will also significantly change the internal political tempo and climate within Europe and create a better process for peace. One event I think can perhaps precipitate this, and that is the fall of the MI6 stained Ukraine regime at the moment. Britain has been playing a major role in this. I can't really see how it can escape blame for this. It would be interesting to see what happens if, for example, a new government exposed the secret clauses of the 100-year agreement between the Zelensky regime and Britain. But I do think, if you like, given Britain doesn't have a viable role, given Britain is so heavily invested in a regime that just does not seem capable of surviving for all that much longer, and itself is clearly an obstacle to peace. I think one can imagine a situation where the other the other 4 parties to the war freeze out Britain, if you like. A new Ukraine regime says, Britain, all you've given me is sorrow. the European Union says stop messing with Europe and get the hell out of here, Britain, all you've brought us is sorrow. Russia says we know your game and we're not putting up with it anymore. We're not talking with you. You're not a constructive partner. And the United States perhaps might even say, well, maybe we should rely less on all that bad British intelligence about Russia. It's only led us down a very blood-stained primrose path. So let me suggest a couple of specific proposals then. I mean, I know I'm just a YouTuber, but let's imagine Ukraine in some sort of post-conflict or at least post-Zelensky regime revokes and publishes the 100-year secret deal between Britain and the Ukraine. It also publishes some of the records of the dealings of the British political and intelligence involvement in this disastrous war, expose Boris Johnson's role, expose MI6's role, expose the role of various public intellectuals from Britain, the Anglophone world. The USA should reduce its reliance on Britain for intelligence of Russia as part of a broader NATO withdrawal. I talked about this in my program, the broader NATO withdrawal, and also in my video on Russia. If the US withdraws from its troops from Eastern Europe to bring down the temperature and to improve the prospects of collective security in Europe, without all those American troops, missiles and spy operations, why the hell does Britain still operate its faded, jaded intelligence empire in Eastern Europe and in the Mediterranean and even around the Black Sea? And the EU, I think, should demand Britain withdraw from Cyprus, withdraw from Spain, acknowledge the fault of its 1707 invasion and give Gibraltar back to Spain. And while we're at it, also give back the Falkland Islands to Argentina. They could do with the resources right now. And similarly, I think Russia should demand or negotiate that British forces, including all their special operations and intelligence bubbles, withdraw from Eastern Europe NATO deployments as well. Since they have been amongst the most aggressive parties, they should go. Collective security of Eurasia does not require the participation of the British Isles, the home of the Mackinder fantasy to dominate the world island, should really be left out of future talks about peace and security in that world island. A dangerous world does not need Britain. Britain's current elites need a dangerous world to justify their ongoing role in places they really should not be. The world will be made less dangerous by reducing Britain's power. We can overcome the deadlock of peace negotiations in Ukraine by freezing Britain out. Thanks for listening. Do head over to jeffrich.substack.com where you can become a paid subscriber and support my work. I've got planning a great program of work into 2026, and your support there will help me deliver it. And to make sure you share, like and subscribe here, particularly like the video if it's offered you some valuable insights into understanding the world today and how to move from war to peace in Ukraine.
Don't know what I want. treasure.